In the entire history of American forensic science, there are only a handful of cases where a single piece of evidence changed the way investigators do their job forever, cases where something so overlooked, so ordinary, became the thread that unraveled a killer's perfect plan. This is one of those cases, and at its center is not a weapon, not a fingerprint, not a strand of hair, but a pile of wood, a bonfire, and the mesquite logs a 21-year-old man brought to a party held at the home of the woman he would murder that same night. On April 23, 2025, the state of Texas executed Moises Mendoza by lethal injection at the Walls unit in Huntsville. He was 41 years old. He had spent over 2 decades on death row for the kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder of 20-year-old Rochelle O'Neal Tollison, a young mother from Farmersville, Texas, who left behind a 6-month-old daughter named Avery. A daughter who would grow up never knowing her mother's voice, never knowing her touch, never once getting to call her mom. Welcome to Criminal Library. Kindly subscribe, turn on the notification bell never to miss our deep dive drops, and this is the full story of what happened on the night of March 17, 2004, what investigators found when they searched for Rochelle, and what the state of Texas did 21 years later. Stay with me. Farmersville, Texas sits about 45 miles northeast of Dallas. If you've never heard of it, that's the point. It's a small town, the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked not out of carelessness, but out of a shared understanding that everyone knows everyone, the kind of place where a young woman could raise a baby daughter, go through the pain of a divorce, and still feel safe enough to sleep with the back door cracked on a warm spring night. Rochelle O'Neal Tollison was born there in January of 1984. She grew up there, and as she entered her 20s, she was building a life there, one that revolved almost entirely around her baby girl, Avery. People who knew Rochelle described her as a devoted mother. Her own mother, Pam, would later say that Avery was Rochelle's oxygen. Everything she did, everything she worked toward, was for that child. She had her struggles, a marriage that hadn't worked out, the stress of a divorce she had filed herself, but none of that changed who she was at her core, a young woman, trying. On the evening of March 17, 2004, Rochelle visited her mother's home. It was a routine thing. She and Pam were close that way. Afterward, she packed up Avery and returned home around 10 o'clock at night. Nothing about the evening was unusual, nothing suggested that by morning, she would be gone. The next morning, Pam O'Neal went to check on her daughter. That, too, was routine, but when she arrived at the house, she knew immediately that something was wrong. The back door was wide open. Inside, the bedroom was in complete chaos. The mattress and box spring had been shoved out of alignment, the headboard was broken, furniture was knocked out of place, papers and objects were scattered across the floor, and in the middle of it all, 6-month-old Avery was lying on the bed, alone, cold, and wet. Rochelle was nowhere. Pam called police, and within hours, Farmersville had mobilized, neighbors on foot, on ATVs, on horseback, dozens of people fanning out across the fields and roads surrounding town, searching for any trace of a young mother who simply wasn't there. They searched for 5 days straight. They found nothing. Investigators noted several details at the scene. Rochelle's purse was still inside the house, her car was untouched. On the kitchen floor, her divorce papers lay face down, pressed flat by a large, muddy boot print. Whoever had been in that house had left in a hurry, but they hadn't come to rob the place, they had come for her. On March 23, 2004, 6 days after Rochelle disappeared, a man walking along a creek bed east of Farmersville, searching for arrowheads in the dirt, found something he wasn't expecting: charred remains in a dugout pit, partially obscured by logs and debris. He stopped, he looked closer, and then he called for help. Investigators responded and confirmed what no one wanted to believe: the remains were human. Because of the extent of the burning, visual identification was impossible. Dental records were used to confirm what Pam O'Neal already feared: it was Rochelle. Her killer had not only taken her life, he had tried to take her identity, too. He had wrapped her body in a tarp, transported it to a remote stretch of his cousin's land, and set it on fire in an attempt to destroy every fingerprint, every trace of himself that might have transferred to her skin. And then he covered the pit with logs and walked away, expecting the earth to swallow what he had done. What he didn't account for was the science of what he left behind. From the beginning, investigators had 2 suspects in their crosshairs. The first was Andrew Tollison, Rochelle's estranged husband. The divorce had been contentious. He had motive, at least on paper, but when detectives checked his alibi, it held. Witnesses confirmed he had been at a party that night, had consumed a significant amount of alcohol, and had been driven home, where he stayed. He never left, but there was something at the crime scene that kept pulling detectives back. The logs stacked over Rochelle's remains, mesquite wood, charred but intact enough for analysis. Investigators collected samples and submitted them alongside samples from the bonfire pit at the party where Andrew had been present. What forensic scientists found was extraordinary. Every single log tested, 8 from the crime scene and 3 from the party, shared an identical chemical signature, the same mixture of trace metals, the same anomalous concentration of titanium. The statistical probability that these logs came from different sources was essentially zero. They had come from the same wood, harvested from the same area, possibly the same tree. It was the first time in the history of American forensic science that burned wood had been successfully used as physical evidence to connect a suspect to a crime scene. The case would later be featured on the television program Forensic Files, and again on Investigation Discoveries Solved, but that left one critical question: who had brought the mesquite wood to the party? It wasn't Andrew Tollison. Witnesses pointed to someone else, a 21-year-old man named Moises Sandoval Mendoza. Moises Sandoval Mendoza was born in January 1984 in Mexico, the same month as Rochelle Tollison. He had grown up in northern Texas, attended grade school alongside her, and by the time he became a suspect, he was working as a heating and air conditioning technician. On the surface, he looked like a young man trying to build something: scholarships, trade school, a path forward, but beneath that surface, his behavior had already begun to fracture. Neighbors recalled an incident in which he had violently pinned down his own mother and sister in their front yard. In 2003, he was arrested in connection with 2 aggravated robberies on the Dallas College Richland campus. He was out on bail for one of those charges on the night he killed Rochelle Tollison. Less than a week before her murder, he had been at a party at her home, approximately 15 people present, her back door familiar to him, her routines visible. He had observed, and he had returned. When detectives first brought Mendoza in for questioning, he didn't deny knowing Rochelle. He admitted he had been at her house the night she disappeared. He claimed she had left with him willingly, that the two of them had gone out together to pick up cigarettes, leaving baby Avery at home. But that explanation required investigators to believe that Rochelle Tollison, a devoted mother, had chosen to walk out of her house in the middle of the night, leaving her 6-month-old daughter completely alone, in a ransacked room, cold and wet. Nobody believed it. The next time investigators brought him in, the story broke open. Mendoza told investigators what had really happened. He said that after they left her home, he began choking Rochelle inside his truck. His words: for no reason, he drove her to a field near his house, where he sexually assaulted her, then choked her again. He dragged her deeper into the field and strangled her a 3rd time, until he was convinced she had stopped breathing, and then, to make certain, he took a knife and stabbed her in the throat. He left her body in that field for several days, but as police began asking questions around town, the panic set in. He returned to where he had left her, wrapped her body in a tarp, and drove to a stretch of remote land belonging to his cousin. There, in a dugout pit near Brushy Creek, he set her on fire. His stated reason, per court records, to destroy his fingerprints. Later, in a letter to his own parents, he wrote, "I don't know what happened to me at that moment. I turned into the devil, and after I did something that I thought was in a dream." He was arrested the day after Rochelle's remains were discovered, not because of the forensic evidence alone, but because he told a friend what he had done. That friend called the police. When investigators confronted him with the physical evidence, the wood, the boots, the jeans, his demeanor was described by the lead detective as completely detached, no remorse, no denial, just stillness, as though none of it had anything to do with him. The case against Mendoza was built on multiple layers of forensic evidence. The burned mesquite logs connected his bonfire to Rochelle's remains. Detectives executed a search of his home and found a pair of boots coated in soot and carrying the scent of gasoline. A forensic analyst compared the tread pattern and wear signatures on those boots to the muddy boot print left on Rochelle's divorce papers in her kitchen, and confirmed it was a match. In his bedroom, investigators also recovered a pair of jeans. Beneath the layer of soot and grime embedded in the fabric were tiny specks of blood. When those samples were submitted for DNA analysis, the results came back unambiguous. The blood belonged to Rochelle O'Neal Tollison. A confession, matching boots, DNA evidence. Forensic wood analysis that had never been used in a criminal case before. The case was overwhelming, and in 2005, a Collin County jury heard all of it. Moises Mendoza stood trial in 2005 before a Collin County jury. Because he had already confessed, the question of whether he committed the crime was never in dispute. The trial centered on punishment, specifically, whether he would be sentenced to death. Under Texas law, a capital murder conviction requires the jury to answer two special questions before a death sentence can be imposed. First, is there a probability that the defendant would commit future acts of violence that constitute a continuing threat to society? Second, are there sufficient mitigating circumstances to warrant a life sentence instead? The prosecution leaned heavily on testimony from a detention officer named Robert Hinton, who claimed Mendoza had initiated a violent altercation with another inmate while awaiting trial. That testimony was used to convince jurors that Mendoza would continue to be dangerous regardless of his environment. Defense attorneys presented clinical psychologist Mark Vigan, who characterized Mendoza as emotionally immature and developmentally behind for his age, a young man whose frontal cortex, the region of the brain governing impulse control and decision-making, was still years from full maturation. The jury heard both sides, and then they asked a specific question during deliberations. They wanted to know more about Mendoza's criminal acts while in jail, including the assault on another inmate. That question would become central to the legal battle that followed over the next 2 decades. On July 1, 2005, Moises Sandoval Mendoza was sentenced to death. What followed was a legal war that stretched across 2 decades and climbed all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Mendoza's appellate attorneys raised several claims, but one cut deepest. They alleged that Robert Hinton's testimony, the detention officer who told the jury Mendoza had started the jailhouse fight, was false. In 2016, the other inmate involved in that altercation, Melvin Johnson, signed an affidavit stating that he had been the aggressor. In a second affidavit filed in March of 2025, just weeks before the execution, Johnson went further. He stated that when his cell door opened with Mendoza already in the recreation area, he understood from the guards that he was meant to attack Mendoza. He said Mendoza immediately fell to the ground and covered himself to protect against the blows. He said Mendoza never threw a single punch. Johnson also claimed he was rewarded with an extra food tray for the attack. No court reviewed the substance of that claim on the merits. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied the appeal without examining it. The United States Supreme Court denied Mendoza's petition for review and his application for a stay of execution on the morning of April 23, 2025, hours before he was scheduled to die. On Monday, April 21, 2025, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles denied his request for clemency. Governor Greg Abbott did not intervene. The date held. Meanwhile, prison records told a different story about who Mendoza had become in the years since his sentencing. He had no disciplinary incidents after 2008, 17 years of clean conduct. He had been baptized in prison and was living on the faith-based wing of death row. He obtained certificates in multiple self-improvement and faith-based programs. Guards, chaplains, and wardens who knew him described a man fundamentally different from the impulsive 20-year-old who had been brought to Huntsville in chains. Those who advocated for his clemency described him as the picture of rehabilitation, but Rochelle Tollison's father, Mark O'Neill, had his own words on the subject. He said plainly that he did not forgive Mendoza. He acknowledged that Mendoza's mother and sisters would lose a son and brother, and said his heart went out to them, but he also said that Mendoza had shown no mercy to his daughter when she begged for her life, and that he had sought to plead for his own. Mendoza had spent 21 years on death row. He was 3 months older than the woman he had killed. The morning of April 23, 2025 broke over Huntsville, Texas the way it always does on execution days, quiet, heavy, deliberate. Somewhere inside the walls unit, Moises Mendoza was in his final hours. His clemency petition had already been rejected. His Supreme Court petition had been denied. There were no more legal doors to open. The machinery of Texas capital punishment, which had been moving toward this moment for over 2 decades, was now hours away from completion. In Texas, condemned inmates no longer receive a special last meal. That practice was eliminated in 2011 after a death row inmate ordered an elaborate spread, multiple meats, a pound of candy, and a variety of sides, and then refused to touch it. After that, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice ended the custom. Mendoza received the same standard meal served to every inmate in the facility that day. In the hours before the execution, a spiritual advisor who had been with Mendoza in his final weeks was present. He had spent time with Mendoza in the weeks and days prior, walking alongside him through what no human language fully prepares a person for, when Mendoza was brought into the execution chamber and strapped to the gurney, his spiritual advisor prayed over him for approximately 2 minutes. Then Mendoza turned to face the family of Rochelle Tolleson, gathered in the observation room on the other side of the glass. He addressed them by name. According to the official record of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, these were his final words. To Mark, Pam, Austin, Uncle Troy, and Jose, I am sorry for having robbed you of Rochelle's life. To Avery, who I know is not here, I robbed you of a mother. I'm sorry for that. I know nothing that I could ever say or do would ever make up for that. I want you to know I am sincere. I apologize. Thank you for being here today. He then turned to the second observation window, where his wife, his sister, and 2 close friends were watching. He spoke to them in Spanish. To all my loved ones, I love you, I am with you, I'm well and at peace, you know that I'm well and everything is love. Don't kill them with kindness, heal them with kindness and love, always love, love, love. Avery Tolleson was not in that room. She was 21 years old, she had lived her entire life without her mother. Mendoza directed his words toward her anyway. At 6:21 p.m., the lethal injection began. Mendoza exhaled 2 loud gasps, his breathing slowed, he snored approximately 10 times, and then his body went still. At 6:40 p.m. on April 23, 2025, Moises Sandoval Mendoza was pronounced dead. He was 41 years old. He was the 3rd person executed in Texas that year, and the 13th executed in the United States in 2025. Rochelle O'Neal Tolleson was 20 years old when she died. She had a baby daughter who was 6 months old. She had a mother who went to check on her every single morning, and a community that mobilized within hours and searched for 5 straight days trying to find her. She never got to hear Avery say her first word. She never got to watch her take her first steps. She never got to be called mom. Her mother, Pam, once said that she and Avery used to watch home videos of Rochelle together, including footage from Avery's first and only Christmas with her mother. They made scrapbooks, they kept her alive in every way they knew how, and still, Pam said, I don't think we'll ever heal. I don't think a mother ever truly heals from the loss of a child. The Collin County District Attorney, Greg Willis, issued a statement after the execution. That the murder of Rochelle Tolleson devastated her family and shocked their community, that justice is not about erasing the past, that it is about honoring the life that was taken. Moises Mendoza spent 21 years on death row, longer than Rochelle Tolleson was alive. Whether those 21 years represent justice or something more complicated, depends on who you are and what you've lost. What is not complicated is this. A young woman who wanted nothing more than to watch her daughter grow up was taken from that daughter on an ordinary night in a small Texas town, and every person who loved her has carried that absence every day since. Rochelle O'Neal Tolleson, January 20, 1984, to March 18, 2004, 20 years old, rest well. If this case stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about Rochelle, about Avery, about the woodpile that cracked a case no one thought would be solved, then you're exactly who this channel is for. Welcome to the community. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We cover cases like this one every week, cases that actually matter, stories told with the respect they deserve. Drop a comment below. Do you think the justice system handled every aspect of this case correctly? I want to hear where you land, and if you want to go deeper, the full playlist is right there. I'll see you in the next one.